Alright guys, BLM back with a new video. In this video, I'll be continuing on with my Survivor What If series, and we'll essentially be doing a sequel video to the previous one, where in the previous video I talked about what if every Final 2 in Survivor history was a Final 3. In this video, we'll be doing what if every Final 3 was a Final 2. So now, how are we going to narrow down the Final 3 to a Final 2? The way I decided to do this for this video is essentially making the person that won the final immunity in these seasons, essentially the person that won Final 4 immunity, have that person also win Final 3 immunity. And then from that point, we'll obviously speculate on who that person votes out. Also with the jury, in most situations, what I'm going to do is swap out the first member of the jury for who would now become the final member of the jury. So that way the number of people on the jury stays the same. Obviously there are going to be exceptions like Edge of Extinction, but for most situations, that will be the case. So those things out of the way, let's get started. So there are 25 seasons at this point that have ended with a Final 3. So let's get started with the very first one with Survivor Cook Islands. And obviously Ozzy won final immunity on that season. So he essentially has to pick between Yul and Becky. And to be honest, I don't know where he goes. Like, I've always thought that he would have voted out Yul, because I do think he recognized that Yul was his biggest threat, that Yul was more than likely his biggest competition in terms of winning the game, and obviously in reality he does lose the game to Yul. However, this being the first version of Ozzy, I do think there's a very good chance that he takes the honorable route, where he wants to face off against the best. And I do think there's a part of Ozzy that thought he was going to win against Yul anyway. So I do think that is a likely outcome, that he does take Yul to the end. In that situation, obviously he still loses because Brad would be swapped out for Becky, and Becky's an even more of a lock vote for Yul than Brad was. So Yul still wins in the 5-4 vote. However, if Ozzy votes out Yul, takes Becky to the end, in that situation Ozzy wins, mind you, barely, like really by a 5-4 vote, where obviously Yul votes for Becky, but Brad is taken off the jury, so that takes away a vote from Becky as well. And the votes play out similarly to how they would have in the Yul-Ozzy Final 2. However, Adam switches his vote, because the only reason Adam voted for Yul was because of the deal he made with Yul when Penner was voted out. And he even talks about this in the reunion show, how he was a man of his word. That was the only reason he voted for Yul, as he wanted to vote for Ozzy. So without that deal being part of this Final 2 situation, I think he very clearly votes for Ozzy over Becky. I do think if Ozzy votes out Yul, he wins the game. However, if he votes out Becky, he loses the game. I personally would guess that he would have taken Becky to the end. However, I don't feel like that's super clear. Now moving on to Survivor Fiji, where we have Dreams having final immunity and having to pick between Earl and Cassandra. And this one's tough too, because I feel like, one, it's clear Dreams and Cassandra were very close, that they were essentially a duo for the entire game. And I think, just again, initially you would think he votes out Earl. But something I do find really weird is during that final vote where Yao Man goes home, Yao Man tries to convince Dreams to vote for Cassandra over Earl, which I never fully got. And that kind of makes it seem to me that was Dreams more willing to take Earl to the end than he was Cassandra? Because why would Yao Man not target Earl at that point? Mind you, obviously Yao Man had a very close relationship with Earl, and I guess he thought that maybe Earl could vote with him. And that entire situation is kind of confusing. And obviously if Dream takes Earl to the end, Earl wins. He might get a vote from Cassandra, but outside of that, he doesn't get any other vote. Now Dreams takes Cassandra to the end, which I do think is the more likely outcome, mind you. I think it becomes a bit more interesting. I do think Cassandra wins. I think it's clear Cassandra wins because the jury just absolutely hated Dreams. However, I think Dreams could get some votes. Yeah, I think he could get the vote of Earl, possibly Yao Man, because as much as Yao Man got screwed over by Dreams, I never felt like Yao Man took anything there personally. So I think he could have gotten Yao Man's vote against Cassandra. But really, at the end of the day, again, it's been confirmed that Cassandra would have won in a Final 2. Though again, the votes there are kind of unclear, but again, I would think that Cassandra wins there. Now moving on to Survivor China, where we have Amanda having final immunity and her having to pick between Todd and Courtney. And I feel pretty confident in this one. I do think she votes out Todd. She's someone that talks for multiple rounds at that point about possibly blindsiding Todd and just never does it. But I do think in this Final 3 situation where she has the choice between Todd, someone who played pretty much the exact same game as her, and someone that she's already been considering voting out, or Courtney, someone that to her probably played a much worse game, I do think she votes out Todd. I do think if she takes Todd to the end, she still loses. Mind you, she might get the votes of like James and Denise, but I mean, she still probably loses there. But in the more likely scenario, as I said, against Courtney, I do think she wins. Obviously, she has a very bad jury performance, but then again, I feel like in the situation of her against Courtney, they would have kind of been forced to vote for her because a lot of the jury members were between her and Todd, and obviously they leaned towards Todd due to obviously his better jury performance, and also I just feel like Todd played the better game. But against Courtney, I do feel like Amanda gets some of those votes. So on this jury, Todd is replacing Jamie, and just looking straight up at the votes against Courtney, I do think Todd votes for Amanda. I do think he votes for the better player out of the two. Yes, he has probably a better relationship with Courtney after the game, but I do think within the game, I do think he votes for Amanda. I think Eric still votes for Amanda. I do think PG votes for Amanda. And I do think Jean Robert votes for Amanda over Courtney, which gives her the win there. I do think Courtney probably gets the votes of James and Denise like she does in the original Final Three, and she possibly gets Frosty in that situation. But I do think Amanda wins out there, though very much by a small margin there. Now moving on to Survivor Gabon. And here we have Susie, of all people, having final immunity. And I think this is very clear. She votes out Bob. She wanted Bob out at the final four. I think she definitely votes him out here at the final three. And that comes down to Susie and Sugar. And I think Susie wins unanimously. Actually, no. I think Bob votes for Sugar. But I think everyone else votes for Susie. I don't think anyone else on that jury was really willing to vote for Sugar. I mean, we have the Corinne, Randy, Charlie contingent who really decide the game. I mean, if they want to vote for Sugar, Sugar can win this in a 4-3 vote. However, I do feel like they side with Susie, and I do feel like Ken, Crystal, and Maddie all side with Susie as well. So I do think Susie wins in a 6-1 vote. Now moving on to Survivor Samoa, and Russell Hantz has final immunity. He has to choose between Natalie and Mick. And I do think he votes out Mick. I think he makes this very clear throughout the season, even after the season, that he thought Natalie was a GOAT, that he didn't think she had any chance of winning. So I do think he takes Natalie to the end, and he loses. Mind you, this is a situation where Eric Cardona doesn't have his speech, but I mean, obviously I don't think that really factored too much into things. I do think Mick probably votes for Russell. Mick seemed to be one of these people that wasn't really too perturbed by Russell's actions out there. I mean, yes, he was like kind of annoyed at points, but I do feel like he probably still votes for Russell. But at the end of the day, I mean, Russell still loses 6-3 because I feel like everything else plays out the way it was. And to be honest, even if Russell was going to the end against Mick, I don't think he wins that either. I think Russell needed to get to the end with Jason or Shambo, and even then, it's like it's a bit more up in the air. But 100% Russell is not winning this final two. But then we move on to heroes versus villains, and this one's really interesting. I mean, not necessarily in what I think would have happened, but what I think could have happened. Because Russell Hantz has final immunity here, once again, and he has to choose between Sandra and Parvati, and I do think he picks Sandra. I mean, again, same thing. Post-game, he's talked in interviews about how much of a GOAT Sandra is. He wanted to vote out Parvati for multiple rounds at this point. I mean, Parvati won out at Final 6, Final 5, and at Final 4, he just changed his mind. But I do think he votes out Parvati in this situation. And in doing so, I think he loses unanimously. Because really, I think his only potential vote is Coach in this situation. Because Coach hated Sandra, but Coach gets taken off the jury in this situation for Parvati. I think Parvati clearly votes for Sandra, and I think everyone else votes for Sandra over Russell. Especially with Jerry now being bitter due to her finding out that Russell voted her out for a jury vote. And also Danielle being obviously upset at Russell at that point, though I do think Danielle's probably the most likely Russell vote in this situation, but again, not great. However, I think the interesting thing is, what if Russell is against Parvati? Now, again, I don't think this was going to happen, but I do think this is a very fascinating scenario because, I mean, people don't like to talk about this, but Russell definitely gets votes against Parvati. I mean, I think there's some people that very clearly vote for Russell in this situation. We're looking at the votes here. I think JT votes for Russell against Parvati. I think Amanda votes for Russell against Parvati. I think there's a chance Candace votes for Russell against Parvati. However, I do think obviously Parvati has some locked votes here. I think Parvati has Courtney, Parvati has Danielle, Parvati has Jerry, Parvati has Sandra. So that becomes a 4-3 with the two deciding votes essentially being Rupert and Colby. And I do think they lean towards Parvati. However, the rest of their alliance, the heroes, people are voting for Russell in this situation. So do they flip over? I don't know. I mean, I think I find it very tough to see Rupert voting for Russell. So I think in turn, Parvati still wins. Though I think this is a much closer vote than people like to give it credit for. Now moving on to Survivor Nicaragua. Here we have Fabio with final immunity. He gets to choose between Chase and Sash. To be honest, it doesn't really matter. He wins in any scenario, but I do think he takes Sash to the end. I mean, it's tough because it's like he was very upset at Sash for essentially pretending to be his friend and that sort of stuff by the time of the final four. But I think he also recognized that Sash was a massive goat and that he wins easily against Sash. While Chase was someone that he didn't have that great of a relationship with, but didn't have the hostility towards either. But I do think he sides towards taking Sash to the end. And in turn, he still wins. I do think Sash gets some votes. I do think Chase votes for Sash. I think there's a chance that like the Hollies and Brendas of the world vote for him. I don't think Jane votes for Sash. I think she probably goes towards Fabio. To be honest, it doesn't matter either way. Fabio wins. It doesn't matter. And even in a Fabio Chase scenario, I mean, I think it plays out exactly the same, though I think Sash probably votes for Chase. Though, I mean, he could vote for Fabio. I mean, either way, it doesn't matter. He wins. Fabio wins. It doesn't matter. Moving on to Redemption Island. I mean, this one doesn't matter either. I mean, we have Boss Rob having final immunity. I think he probably votes out Natalie, and then I think he wins near unanimously. It's the same scenario. I mean, he votes out Natalie. I think he gets every vote but Ralph against Philip. I mean, I think he still wins against Natalie, probably unanimously at that point. I mean, maybe Ralph is super bitter against him and votes for Natalie, but I feel like that's probably not even the case. I feel like he probably wins unanimously against Natalie, but again, it doesn't matter. Boston Rob wins either scenario. Now moving on to South Pacific, and here we have Sophie having final immunity, and she gets to choose between Coach and Albert. And this one's interesting because I feel like Coach was definitely her biggest competition in terms of once she got to the end, though I think her mindset was more so Coach was her GOAT. And because I do think she votes out Albert. I think she looked at Albert as her bigger threat. So I think she votes out Albert, and I think she still wins with the same votes. I mean, in this situation, I guess Jim Rice gets replaced. I don't know, it's weird because Redemption Island is just weird. Obviously, Keith was the first person voted out, but Keith was technically the second member of the jury. I don't know if Jim Rice gets swapped out for Albert, but it doesn't really matter. I mean, it's the same thing. Like, I mean, you're swapping a Sophie vote for a Sophie vote. I mean, I think Albert votes for Sophie against Coach. And really, I think same thing. Sophie wins 6-3. And if you have Sophie and Albert at the end, I think Sophie wins possibly unanimously. I mean, Coach's vote is kind of a little bit up in the air. I think for the most part, Sophie wins unanimously in that situation as well. Now moving on to One World, and this is another one that doesn't matter. I mean, we have Kim having final immunity. She chooses between Chelsea and Sabrina. Who does she take to the end? I think she takes Chelsea. But that one's kind of tough because Chelsea's obviously her final two from the very beginning. That's someone that she was very closely working with. And I do think she takes Chelsea to the end, though she did also state that Chelsea was her biggest threat. Though that was at Final Tribal, and I have a feeling that that was more so as a way to try to take votes away from Sabrina because she knew Sabrina was getting votes. So I don't know. I think she votes Sabrina out, takes Chelsea to the end. And in that scenario, I mean, she wins unanimously? No, because Troyzan, yeah. Troyzan probably votes for Chelsea. I think Leaf also still votes for Chelsea. But everyone else should be voting for Kim in that situation. So she still wins in a 7-2. And the exact same if she takes Sabrina to the end. I mean, it's the exact same scenario. Because I just feel like Leaf and Troyzan were just never voting for Kim, no matter who she was up against. But everyone else was always voting for Kim, no matter who she was up against. So, yeah, Kim wins. Now we got Survivor Philippines. And this one is, Mike Skupin has final immunity. And he gets to pick between Denise and Lisa. I think he very clearly votes out Denise. And we get a Lisa Michael Skupin final two. And I think Lisa wins. Actually, no, I should say, I know Lisa wins. We know, like we've heard from interviews, pretty much how every single person would have voted here. Carter still votes for Skupin. And Malcolm and Denise have both confirmed in exit interviews that they would have voted for Skupin in that final two. However, everyone else votes for Lisa. I mean, RC already voted for Lisa. Pete, Abby, and Artis, that contingent is confirmed to vote for Lisa. Jeff Kent was never voting for Michael Skupin to win the game. So there you go. I mean, it's a 5-3 vote. Lisa wins. That one's pretty easy. We get to Caramoan, and it doesn't matter. Again, Cochran wins any scenario, but Cochran has final immunity. He votes out either Dawn or Sherry. I think he votes out Sherry. Gets to the end with Dawn. I think Sherry could vote for Dawn. Actually, I think Sherry probably votes for Dawn. So at least Dawn gets a vote, but everything else stays the same. It should be a 7-1 vote pretty easily there. Though if it was the other way around where Cochran votes out Dawn, I do think Cochran wins unanimously in that scenario. Now moving on to Blood versus Water, and this is another one where it doesn't really matter. Tyson has immunity. He gets to pick between Monica and Jervis. I think he takes Jervis to the end. Again, Jervis was his final 2. I think he also clearly knew he was going to win against Jervis, so I do think he takes Jervis to the end. And I think Tyson wins near unanimously. The questions here are, does he get Monica's vote? Which I think he does still. And the other question is, what does Vetus do? Because this is kind of a weird thing where Vetus voted for Monica because of 2 things. One, he told Tyson he wasn't going to vote for him. And the second thing is he was very bitter against Jervis and didn't want Jervis to get second place. However, in this scenario, he can't have it both ways. He needs to vote for either Tyson or Jervis. So I do think he leans Tyson. I think his bitterness for Jervis is more than his actual comment of, I'm never voting for Tyson, but really, again, doesn't matter. Now moving on to San Juan del Sur, we have Jacqueline having final immunity. I think this one's really fascinating because Jacqueline has to choose between Natalie and Missy. Natalie's someone who literally saved her at the final 5 with her idol. But also, Jacqueline clearly knew she was the bigger threat. She even says that in confessional at the final 4 that Natalie is a massive threat. So do you vote out that massive threat? Or do you vote out a goat in Missy? Because the reason why Jacqueline keeps Natalie at the final 4 is because she acknowledged that she was going to lose to both Natalie and Keith. So essentially, she was picking the winner, and she wanted Natalie to win because Natalie saved her. But in a final 2 scenario, Jacqueline has a good chance of winning. Straight up, Jacqueline wins against Missy. So I do think in this scenario, I think Jacqueline votes on Natalie. I think Jacqueline votes on Natalie, takes Missy to the end. And in this situation, Jacqueline should win the jury vote. And Missy does get votes here. Missy gets Jeremy's vote, gets Natalie's vote, gets Baylor's vote. However, I do think everyone else votes for Jacqueline. I mean, obviously John Nish is voting for Jacqueline. Reed's voting for Jacqueline. I think Alec and Keith and Wes, that contingent, is voting for Jacqueline. So Jacqueline ends up winning in a 5-3 vote. Now moving on to Worlds Apart, and this one doesn't matter because Mike Holloway wins final immunity. He has to pick between Will Sims and Carolyn. And who does he take to the end? I actually think he probably takes Carolyn, right? Because I think he thinks he wins anyway, which he does. So I could very likely see him taking Carolyn to the end. And in that scenario, does he win unanimously? I mean, no, because I guess Sierra Dawn Thomas probably votes for Carolyn. But I do think he possibly gets every other vote. I mean, I don't know. Rodney could vote for Carolyn over. Actually, yeah, I think Rodney probably votes for Carolyn. I mean, Will is kind of up in the air, but it doesn't really matter. Mike still wins 6-2 or 5-3. It doesn't really matter. Now moving on to Second Chance. And here we have Jeremy having final immunity and gets to choose between Spencer or Tasha. I think he clearly votes out Spencer here. He talks about how Spencer was his biggest threat, so I do think Spencer gets voted out. And in Jeremy versus Tasha, I mean, Jeremy still wins unanimously, right? Like, I'm trying to think of this. Yeah, Spencer votes for Jeremy, so yeah, I mean, Jeremy still wins unanimously. I don't really think it's close either. I really don't see anyone voting for Tasha over Jeremy. Now moving on to Kaoh Rong, and here we have Michelle having final immunity, and it's clear, right, that she votes out Aubrey. I mean, she talks about how Aubrey's her biggest threat. She wanted Aubrey out the final 4. She clearly votes out Aubrey. So we have a final 2 of Michelle and Ty, and I do think Ty has some votes, and this is another thing that I guess I should think about. Is Neil on the jury? I guess no, right? I mean, I guess Neil was never on the jury, if you really want to think about it, because like he would have been swapped out for Aubrey anyway. But I think in this situation, I'm not even going to include him on the jury, and I'm going to swap out Nick for Aubrey, which actually that really harms Ty's chances of winning the game, because I do think Nick and Aubrey are both tie votes. Michelle still gets the votes of Sydney, Debbie, Julia, and I think she also probably gets the vote of Joe, which already gives her to win. So I guess there's a chance that Jason and Scott vote for Ty, but again, they voted for Michelle over Ty in the actual final 3. So yeah, I do think they vote for Michelle, and that does give Michelle the win there. So yeah, again, not really much of a chance for anything other than Michelle win with her being in that final 2. Now for Millennials versus Gen X, and here we have Ken having final immunity, and he has to choose between Hannah or Adam. I think he votes out Adam, right? I do think Ken looked at Adam as the bigger threat. So let's say he votes out Adam and we get to the final two with Ken and Hannah. I think Hannah wins. Mind you, this would have been a fantastic final travel with how much the jury didn't like either of them and how both of them were looked at as like the biggest goats of the season. But I do think Hannah wins this scenario. I think Adam clearly votes for Hannah. I think there's a chance David votes for Ken in this situation, but even then, I think he votes for Hannah. Brett was never voting for Ken. I think Jay could go either way. I don't think he was as bitter against Ken, but Sunday, I think, sides with everyone else voting for Hannah. I mean, we could skip forward to Chris. I think Chris votes for Hannah. He talks about not liking Ken. Will Wall, I can't see voting for Ken. So, I mean, really, again, I think this is more so an anti-Ken vote than a pro-Hannah vote, but I do think Hannah wins this, though it's still kind of up in the air. And obviously, if Ken ends up taking Adam to the end, Adam wins unanimously. I mean, there's really no question there, so Ken never really had a shot here. From Survivor Game Changers, we have Brad Culpepper having final immunity, and he has to pick between Sarah Lacina or Troyzan, and I think he clearly votes out Sarah Lacina, which means it's him versus Troyzan at the end, and I think Brad Culpepper clearly wins this final two. Mind you, I do think there's obviously chances for Troyzan to get votes. Like, I think Sarah Lacina probably votes for Troyzan. I mean, she talks about having a much closer relationship with Troyzan than she had with Brad. I could see Ty being bitter against Brad, but I do think he votes for Brad. I think Aubrey votes for Brad. I don't know how Sari or Michaela vote because both of them seem to be very anti-Brad, but I just don't know if they're willing to vote for Troyzan either. I think Andrea is a Brad vote. I think Sierra Dawn Thomas is a clear Brad vote. I think Zeke, Debbie, Ozzy, very clear Brad votes in this situation. Haley is kind of up in the air, though I do think she leans towards Brad. So, I mean, really, it doesn't matter. Brad still wins this scenario, though there are definitely votes that could go towards Troyzan, namely that, like, Sari, Michaela, Sarah Lacina sort of contingent. Maybe even an Andrea. I don't think she's a complete lock there. Maybe even a Haley, but again, not enough. Now moving on to HHH, and here we have Chrissy Hoffbeck having final immunity, her getting the pick between Ryan and Ben. She clearly votes out Ben. And this is a fun scenario. I think Chrissy versus Ryan is very interesting because this is something that I personally believe Ryan wins. But I feel like there's a lot of people out there that think Chrissy wins. So in this scenario, Desi isn't on the jury. And I think Desi was someone that was definitely leaning towards Ryan in that situation. So I think that changes some things. But then in Ben, Ben is a locked Ryan vote. I mean, he talks postseason so highly of Ryan. And even in his like exit interviews and stuff, like he is always talks so positively about Ryan. I think he's a clear Ryan vote. Devin voted for Ryan, so I mean, that's a clear Ryan vote. Mike, I think, votes for Chrissy. Ashley voted for Chrissy. But then we get to the interesting ones, the votes that didn't go towards either of them in the original Final 3. So essentially the votes that went towards Ben. So we have Lauren Rimmer, who I think goes for Ryan. I mean, she had a closer relationship with Ryan. She was on the original tribe with Ryan. And she never particularly seemed to have a close relationship with Chrissy and even seemed to have a dislike for Chrissy at points, so I do think she goes for Ryan. Joe Mena has been all over the board with what he talks about, who he would have voted for. I think he votes for Ryan. That's what he said when he initially got off the season. Since then, he's kind of changed his story and talks about how he would have voted for Chrissy. But I do think he would have voted for Ryan, especially with how he seemed to be very bitter against Chrissy at that point. JP, I do think votes for Chrissy in this situation. And then we're left with Cole. And I do think Cole goes for Ryan. Again, Cole didn't seem as bitter with Chrissy as everyone else. I mean, he wasn't as bitter as like Desi or Joe at the time. Though I do think he still sides with that group, which was supposedly voting for Ryan. So I do think Ryan wins in a 5-3 vote. But again, there are votes here that are left up for interpretation. Now for Ghost Island, this one's kind of boring. I mean, Dominic has final immunity. He votes out Wendell. That's very clear. He wins unanimously. I don't see anyone voting for Laurel over Dominic unless it's like Donathan. And even then, I could see Donathan voting for Dominic. It's really clear Dominic wins this. Now for David versus Goliath, and here we have Nick Wilson having final immunity, and this really, again, doesn't matter, though I do think he votes out Mike White. I think he looked at Mike White as his biggest threat between Mike and Angelina, and I think Nick might win unanimously against Angelina, because, like, Allison's not voting for Angelina. Kara could. I mean, that could be something. I think Mike White's easily voting for Nick, and I think Christian votes for Nick in that situation. So, I mean, it could be a 9-1 vote, but either way, I think Nick's easily winning that. Now for Edge of Extinction, and here we have Chris Underwood. I guess we're going to still consider the final immunity winner, right? Even though he gives up final immunity, I mean, he's still technically the winner there. So who's he vote out between Julie or Gavin? I think it doesn't matter, but I think he votes out Gavin. I think that's kind of indicative of him giving immunity to Julie. I think he looked at Julie as his least threat there. So I think he votes out Gavin, but again, doesn't matter. I mean, he still wins. And again, this is Edge of Extinction, so I'm not going to eliminate the first jury member. So Chris should still win here in a pretty dominant fashion. We're just adding one more vote to Julie. And even then, I don't know if like Lauren still votes for Julie in this situation, or Kelly Wentworth votes for Julie. Like, I mean, I don't think some of these votes that went towards Gavin still go to Julie. And then, so I mean, Chris probably even wins in a larger fashion there. Now for IOI, and this one's kind of interesting because we have Nora having final immunity and her having to choose between Dean and Tommy, essentially her picking the winner. I think she goes for Tommy, right? I think she takes Tommy to the end, I should say. And I think this is indicative of what he did at the Final Four, where he was able to convince her to not put him in the fire-making challenge. I think that's indicative of who she was more willing to take to the end. Though at the same time, Nora has talked the postseason that she did see Tommy as her biggest threat, but I mean, that could be influenced by the edit. But also, I could see that being a reality. So, I mean, maybe she takes Dean to the end. It doesn't really matter. I mean, either one that she takes to the end wins against her. I mean, Nora had no shot of winning that season. So, whoever she picks wins the season. I think she picks Tommy, but there is a chance she picks Dean. Now for Winners at War, and oh my god, this is the darkest timeline where we have Natalie having final immunity and she votes out Tony. Just imagine Winners at War where Tony gets voted out at the final three. How devastating would that be? But we have Natalie and Michelle in the final two, and I think this one's interesting because I do think there's a chance Michelle wins this, right? Because if we're looking at the votes, and let's just go through them. I mean, we have Tony as a vote, clear vote for Michelle. We have Sarah, I think in this situation, a clear vote for Michelle because I don't think she was voting for the Edge person. Ben, I think, is a vote for Michelle. I don't think she was voting for the Edge person. Denise, Michelle, I don't think she was voting for the Edge person. Nick, Michelle, I think that's very clear. Jeremy votes for Natalie. I mean, Natalie was obviously pretty much a family member of his at this point. I think he votes for Natalie. Kim. Ooh, Kim's tough. Let's actually hold off on Kim because I'm not entirely sure. And same thing goes for Sophie as well. I think those are probably two of the swing votes here of where it's very unclear of exactly where they would have gone. Tyson, I think, votes for Natalie. I think Adam votes for Michelle. Wendell votes for Michelle. Yule votes for Michelle. Parvati votes for Natalie. Rob, I think, votes for Natalie in this situation. Ethan votes for Natalie. I think Danny votes for Michelle, doesn't she? Amber votes for Natalie. Yeah, so actually, now I think about it, Michelle wins. Because in this situation that we've talked about, there are 17 jury votes, and I just counted 9 locked votes for Michelle, where Natalie has 6 locked votes, and then there's the mixed sort of votes from Sophie and Kim. But that essentially means Michelle wins the game, I think. Again, I mean, there could be bitterness with Yule, but again, Yule was also bitter towards Natalie. Danny could have voted for Natalie, but supposedly she was really close with Wendell, and Wendell was pretty pro Michelle at that point. And supposedly Danny was part of that contingent that was thinking about throwing votes on Michelle to try to get Michelle second place. So I think she's probably leaning towards Michelle. So I do think Michelle does win this final too, actually. That's something I actually never really fully thought out until now, but after playing it out, I do think that's probably the case. But there we go. That is every final 3 scenario in History Survivor and talking about what would have happened if it was a final 2. Yeah, I have a lot of fun doing these Survivor What If videos. I think I will definitely do more in the future. I have a couple more ideas in my head of obvious ones to do. I think the next one I will do will probably be what if fire making winners lost. I think that'll be a fun what if scenario to do. We could also do a video on like what if Edge of Extinction never happened. I think there's also like swapping out the winners for the fallen angels, and what if the winner faced off against the final angel in the final 2. Like all these different things that we could possibly do for the future. But for now, that's the video. Thank you for watching.